I want to start out by first saying that there's a book that was written by a man. His name is A.W. Tozer, and he's one of my favorite authors. And he wrote a book called The Knowledge of the Holy, and I don't have that with me at the moment, but I remember something he said in the book, or he wrote in the book, and it's always stuck with me, for over the last 30 years. He said, talking about God and his attributes, he said, "Oh, how he eludes us, because he is everywhere, and yet he is nowhere." And the reason I bring that up is because that's the way it is with truth, with spiritual truth specifically, is the truth can be staring you in the face and you just can't see it. This is why the expression in the Bible that Jesus used, and even in the Old Testament used, is "Let him who has ears, let him hear," or "He who has eyes to see, let him see." Because you can be looking at something and not even really realize the truth of what you're looking at. And so that's the way it is with spiritual truth. And that's the encounter that I bring up in my book with Jesus and Nicodemus. Because Nicodemus was trained in the Jewish tradition, and obviously he was a scholar when it came to biblical studies. And yet, he had studied about the Messiah. Their whole way of life was looking and waiting for the Messiah. And here the Messiah was in front of him. And while he knew something was there, because he said the words, "We know that you must be from God, because nobody can do the things you do unless he was from God." But see, he said that with a bit of skepticism, because he knew that was true, but at the same time, he was not sure. And the Messiah himself, was sitting right in front of him, and he had a hard time seeing the truth of that. That's just the way it is. It's the way it is for everybody, and not just Nicodemus. And it's the way it is for us too. Sometimes we can grab onto a way of thinking, but that way of thinking is wrong, but we think it's the truth. And so I like to say it like this: when you're on your journey in your Christian walk, you're going to have to make adjustments along the way. And as new light and new revelation and new understanding from the scriptures is revealed to you, and that's just it. It has to be revealed to you. Spiritual truth comes from God opening up your eyes. And the only way that you can get to the place where God does that, right? He opens up the eyes of your understanding, is you have to maintain a humble attitude. Because the proud will not find the truth. Those who think they're right and they don't humble themselves before the Lord is not going to reveal truth to them. And so when it comes to certain doctrines like, the rapture of the church and different things, it's no different than, back in the first century when religious men, people who loved God, they gravitated towards certain ways of thinking or perceptions that they thought were right, but they weren't right. But they defended their way of thinking. Even in the face of the truth sitting right in front of them, they couldn't see it. And that's the way it is today, especially when we're talking about eschatology. So people gravitate towards ways of thinking, and a lot of times those ways of thinking are not right, of course. There's lots of different views on the end times, and they're not all right. There's only one right way, one right and scriptural way to think about these things, but yet there's all kinds of really good people, sincere, really good people who believe things that aren't right. So how does that happen? It just happens because people gravitate, and I did the same thing with the pre-trib rapture. I gravitated towards a way of thinking, and I kind of convinced myself that way of thinking was the truth. And so I started defending that way of thinking despite the scripture. It's a strange thing, but you become a defender of your way of thinking instead of a defender of the truth. And the best way to go about walking out the Christian life is to just be a lover of the truth and know that you have wrong ways of thinking and be humble about that. And then as you go through life, you got to make adjustments. And I'm continually making adjustments to the way, as the scriptures become more and more enlightened, I become enlightened to them. And the Lord reveals more. I have to continually make adjustments, because I know even where I am right now, and I've been on this journey for 30 years in studying eschatology. I continually make adjustments and minor adjustments because I know that even in the place I am right now, I don't understand and I don't know everything. But I have tried to and have endeavored to be humble and acknowledge that, at least internally, and to God, and be open to the idea that I need to change. So sometimes those changes and those adjustments are big. Of course, those are the hardest ones. So when in 2006, when I was still a pre-tribber, and I was confronted with the truth of the sixth seal. Okay, that moment was a crossroads in my life. If I wouldn't have humbled myself to open up myself to the possibility that the Lord was showing something to me, I would have never seen the truth. I would have never grabbed onto the spiritual truth that God was trying to show me. I could have, and I had done this previous to that, where I was so enamored with the pre-trib view that it was right, and that I was trying to defend it, right, and teach it and convince people of it, right, that I didn't even really realize what I was doing. I didn't know that I was actually rejecting the Lord and His patient, guidance to help me to make an adjustment. And so when the time came, when the Lord opened my eyes to it, I didn't turn a blind eye. I continued down that path and said, Lord, I want to put what I think I know at the altar. And I put it at the altar, and I said, if this is wrong, if I'm not seeing something, then reveal it to me. I humble myself to you to know that I am a flawed person in my reasoning and that I can miss it. And so I went through that process. And, I think that's the key, is to always kind of be humble about where you are, no matter how far you go down the road of, the right road. There's just adjustments that always got to be made. And so, I bring up in the book, the story of Nicodemus, because I think that's just a classic example of somebody who is at the point of they're getting a glimpse of something, right? Nicodemus was getting a glimpse of the truth. He was standing, right in front of him, talking to him, and he was struggling with it, but he recognized something was there. And I guess that's the critical place. That's the crux of life as a Christian, is in those moments, what are we going to do? And I think everybody kind of faces those types of situations and finds themselves in those moments when they have to decide whether they're going to just dig their heels in and double down on what they think is true and the way that they reason it all out, or are they going to lay that on the altar every day on a daily basis and say, Lord, please inspect this. If there's anything wrong with the way I think, reveal it to me. And then you really have to trust the Lord, because without His word, we are in darkness. We really are. And without Him revealing the truth of His word, we can't find the truth. And so spiritual truth is elusive. I should, say, just as I quoted A.W. Tozer, God is elusive that way. He is the truth, and therefore his truth is a bit elusive. And, I think he created it that way on purpose, because he reserves the revealing of the truth for those who are humble. It's just the way it is. I don't know what else to say. And that's the biggest lesson I've learned in my life. I'm no different than anybody else, I don't think, where I have to humble myself to the Lord and not think that, I know everything. Anything that we know that is true, we should take absolutely no credit for knowing that truth, because we wouldn't know that truth if it weren't revealed to us by God. So even in the things that we know are true and that we have correct, we have to give glory to God, because he's the one who revealed that to us, and be grateful for the light that he allowed to come into our understanding. And so when it comes to the scriptures, the way that the Lord gave us truth, he did it in an interesting way. And I bring this out in my book about types and shadows. And this goes to kind of, in my mind, we have the physical realm, we have the earthly realm, the physical world, the physical creation that we live in. And then there's the spiritual realm. And there's indications in Scripture that like in Hebrews and so on, where the things in the physical realm are patterned after things in the spiritual realm. And very much so, that's true when it comes to Israel and the temple, right? All of the feasts and all these things are patterned after spiritual truths that come from the spiritual realm. But it started out that way in the beginning, and you guys probably know this. But this is an interesting point, is that even in Genesis chapter 1, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And then it says that he created light. But if you notice, he created light before he created the sun, moon, and stars. And when I think about this, I think about light. How can you have light without the physical realm? Or how can you have light outside of the physical realm? And what I'm saying is I think God created light in the spiritual realm. And then the sun, moon, and stars are representations and patterned after what's in the spiritual realm. So I think, that's just my own personal observation, but I think that's just the pattern, all through Scripture. That I'm not saying that the spiritual realm is more real than the natural realm, because that, you can go down the wrong road and get into Gnosticism and all that kind of stuff. And I don't intend to go down and say anything like the spiritual realm is pure and the physical realm is unholy, like the Gnostics did in the 1st and 2nd century. But there is a truth that's revealed in Scripture about the fact that the things in the physical realm are patterned after things in the spiritual realm. And I think that there's an indication of this even when Jesus was talking to Nicodemus. And he said in verse 12, in verse 11, he says, I tell you the solemn truth, we speak about what we know, and we testify about what we have seen. But you people, now he's, in the Greek, see, I don't know what translation you guys are reading this out of, but in the NET translation, it's, but you people, so it's plural there, right? So he's saying you people, he's talking to Nicodemus and his crowd, you people do not accept our testimony. And the reason that Jesus is speaking in the plural is because Nicodemus started out asking the question. He said, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher. So Jesus is just following after the pattern that Nicodemus started. And he said, so he answers him directly and specifically. In verse 11, it says, but you people do not accept our testimony. If I have told you people about earthly things and you don't believe, how will you believe if I tell you about heavenly things? Okay, so I think Jesus is kind of hinting at this, that the heavenly things are the mold that the earthly things are patterned after. It's interesting how the Lord did this. It's very interesting because I look at Israel and I see that God is revealing spiritual truth through earthly things. But the earthly things that he's using aren't the spiritual truth. They're patterned after the spiritual truth. And so by doing this, what he has done is he's giving us a roadmap to spiritual truth. And so a lot of times when we study the Old Testament, we need to pay attention to the roadmap. And Israel is the roadmap, and all of the history of Israel is the roadmap that's leading us somewhere. It's not the end of the story. It's leading us somewhere. God was very gracious to the whole world when he created Israel. It was his way of reaching out to mankind because he was trying to teach the world spiritual truth, and he did it through the people of Israel. And so we should be very, very grateful for Israel and what, the privilege that God had given them for using them to reveal his spiritual truth. That can get into a whole study then of types and shadows, okay? And, some of the obvious ones are the temple or the sanctuary in the Old Testament. This was patterned after what was shown to Moses on the heavenly mountain. Now, when you look at that, you can actually look at that two different ways. Okay, you could say, okay, the pattern that was shown to Moses, okay, is this just the instruction? Like God just gave him instruction on how to build the sanctuary? Because that's one way to look at it. Or did Moses see into the spiritual realm and see the heavenly temple? And he's saying, build the earthly sanctuary after the things that you saw in the spiritual realm, meaning after the heavenly temple you saw in the spiritual realm. Or is it simply God gave him instruction on how to build the temple and Moses didn't actually see the spiritual temple in heaven? Because, there is a spiritual temple in heaven. I mean, you got in Revelation chapter 16, it says before the bowl judgments are opened, it says, and the temple in heaven was opened. So there is a temple in heaven, right? And the earthly sanctuary, the earthly temple was patterned after the heavenly temple. And so that's just number one. Number two is, the sacrifices. Let's just take the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. Obviously, everybody knows about that one because it was a type and a shadow of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. And so the purpose for everything related to the Passover was to lead people to the spiritual truth, and not just Jewish people, but the whole world. So what God did through Israel was not just for Israel, it was for the whole world. God was using Israel to reveal spiritual truth to the whole world. They just had the honor of being the ones who God was using, and that makes them special, honored. I mean, they have a special place in God's story. They have a special place in the gospel story. Okay, and then, back to John chapter 3, verse 14, Jesus says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. And so here's another type and shadow of a spiritual truth. That story that happened, God used it to reveal spiritual truth. So I bring up also in my book the story about Abraham and how he, in Hebrews, is said to have been searching for the city, a heavenly city, whose builder and maker is God. And so, this is hundreds of years before Moses. Abraham sees the temple in heaven. the city, I should say. He sees the city and the temple. The city and the temple, so a lot of times they're interchangeable, because everybody in, ancient times, when they thought about Jerusalem, they thought about, oh, that's where the temple is. So in reality, Jerusalem, the temple, in biblical poetry and some of the, the writings of the prophets, they use these terms interchangeably in a poetic way, because, Jerusalem was the city of God, where the temple was, right? And so Moses saw the temple. I believe that he actually saw in the spiritual realm and saw the temple that God was building. And he was told to pattern the earthly temple after that. Well, it says in Hebrews that Abraham searched for a city. Well, of course, we know that that city is the New Jerusalem, which is the heavenly city that comes down from God. But I listed in my book that there is a tradition, and that tradition has been put in the book of 2nd Baruch, that Abraham knew about that heavenly city when God put him to sleep and showed him cut the animals in two, and then God walked up and down the middle of the portions of the animals. And while Abraham was in that deep sleep, the tradition is, and that's what this book of 2nd Baruch says, is that's when Abraham saw the city that God was building, the heavenly city, New Jerusalem. And also, not only him, but others, including Adam, had seen it and were aware of what God was doing. And this is just a symbol. It's imagery. It's talking about the people of faith. The city represents that. Like if you go to the story in the Gospels where Jesus was giving the Sermon on the Mount, and their location where he's giving this sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, he's outside of Jerusalem. He's not in Jerusalem. But he says to the whole crowd that, these are believers, right, in him, and they're following him. And he says, you are the light of the world. And he says, a city on a hill cannot be hid. Those two phrases that he said there are not separate. They need to be joined together. When he says you are the light of the world, he's referencing Jerusalem. Isaiah chapter 60, I believe it says, arise and shine, for your light is come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. Okay, in one sense, this is talking about Israel and Jerusalem as God has used them to bring the light of the truth of his word to the world. And so now he's in front of this crowd on a hill up in Galilee, outside of Jerusalem. And he says to his followers, you are the light of the world. Okay, he's transitioning this in a way that I don't think anybody expected. This is one of those spiritual truths that, we need to meditate on and, grab a hold of ourselves. This is a major thing here. He's saying, you are the light of the world. He's not pointing to Jerusalem, the city, anymore. He's saying Jerusalem itself is the light of the world. He's saying to his believers, his followers, you are the light of the world. Well, where does that leave earthly Jerusalem? And where does that leave Israel? It leaves them in a good place, because they are also the light of the world, that God created them to be the light of the world, to bring the good news. But Israel was showing them the spiritual truth that the people of God, okay, the people of God, not just Israel, but all people who are believers of all time, are what we could call spiritual Israel, or, sometimes people call it true Israel, but I don't know if I like that, because true Israel means, it gives the connotation that natural Israel is false Israel, true and false. It's like this dichotomy. I don't think that that's appropriate, and I used to call it true Israel, but I think I like spiritual Israel better, because I think spiritual and natural gives a better connotation, if that makes sense. And so all Jesus is doing is he's pointing out that those who are of faith and that are followers of Jesus, and even, you think in the Old Testament, well, they weren't followers of Jesus. But yes, they were. If they were true believers in God and following his word, they, especially during the time of the law in those days, after Moses, if they were obedient to do the things that they were supposed to do and the sacrifice, all those things were pointing to Jesus. So their faith is shown in that they were believing that what they were doing, even though they didn't have full understanding, they were still believing in the type. And that is accounted to them for faith and righteousness. And so they were true believers, those who, took these things to heart. Just like them in the New Testament times, and even during the time when Jesus was talking to them on the Sermon on the Mount, he was talking to those who were following him, but they were all just still trying to figure things out, right? They were still, practitioners of Jewish tradition and Jewish law. But they had seen Jesus was the Messiah, so they're following him, but they're trying to hash this all out and figure out, what does this all mean? And Jesus turns to them and says, you are the light of the world. And this is a big transition because in their minds, the natural city of Jerusalem and the temple, which was in the city, was the light of the world in their custom and in their mind. And so what is Jesus doing? He's revealing spiritual truth. The spiritual truth was hidden in the type. And now Jesus is revealing the spiritual truth or the spiritual aspect of what the type was representing. And so that's the same thing with Abraham. He was looking for the city, the heavenly city, whose builder and maker is God. And, I bring up the question, well, he was told that his inheritance would be the natural, literal, earthly promised land. So why is he looking for something different when the promised land was what he was told would be his inheritance and the inheritance of his children and his children's children and so on for an eternal inheritance? Why is he, what is he doing looking for something else? Because what God showed him was that the promised land was a type and a shadow of a spiritual truth. And he was grabbing onto the spiritual truth aspect of the type and shadow. And so what I'm saying is, even in the Old Testament times, the people of God had the ability to recognize spiritual truth. Abraham certainly did. Moses certainly did. And I'm sure that they were preachers of spiritual truth, that they were saying in the teaching of doing all of the natural things and natural requirements and sacrifices and celebrating the feasts and all these things, that the believers, the true believers, were always aware and cognizant that all of the things that they were doing had great spiritual significance. Okay, and they weren't just going through the motions. Now, some of them were just going through the motions, and they didn't recognize the spiritual significance. Okay, and that's where, by the time Jesus is meeting with Nicodemus, things become kind of, boring. You're just going through the motions. Yet, Nicodemus had enough sense to know that there's more to what we can see. There's spiritual truth. And so he was open to the possibility. Okay, and others weren't. And that was what happened then, and that's exactly what's happening now. Some are open to the possibilities of spiritual truth, and some aren't. And even in our study of eschatology, in all of the different views out there within premillennialism, talking about the rapture and where do we put the rapture and how do we interpret, the sun-clothed woman, and how do we interpret the male child, and what I'm saying is we're left with a choice. Are we going to gravitate towards looking at the natural types and shadows of these things, or are we going to be open to understanding that these things are actually pointing to the spiritual truth that the types and shadows were actually pointing to? And in my opinion, being aware of that is the key to unraveling the book of Revelation. that you have to be aware of the spiritual truth of the types and shadows. And, for example, the sun-clothed woman. Traditionally, and almost everybody will say that, sun-clothed woman is talking about natural Israel. Well, if you go down that road, I think you're going to miss out on a really big blessing in the book of Revelation, because I don't believe that it's pointing to natural Israel. I believe it's pointing to what natural Israel was pointing to. And that is, spiritual Israel, or the New Jerusalem, right? The sun-clothed woman shining like the sun. And, we go to the description of the heavenly Jerusalem, and it's shining like the sun. Now, this is a leap, okay? We are spiritual people, right? Our faith is spiritual. Okay, so is it any strange thing that we think about spiritual things? Okay, some people would say, you're so spiritually minded, you're no earthly good. But I think that just the best way to look at it is understand what the types and shadows are that God put in the Old Testament, and then also understand what those types and shadows were a picture of, or what they were pointing to, the spiritual truth that those things represent. And then when you get that, when you understand that, you have to take that truth, that progressive revelation, okay, that the New Testament affords us, and you have to take that into the book of Revelation with you. And if you don't take it into the book of Revelation with you, you will not be equipped to unravel the symbolism and the imagery that the book of Revelation displays.